The first encounter, the sun was setting behind the tall mountains, casting long shadows over the barren landscape. The ground was dry, cracked from the heat of the day, and the air was thick with dust. Amidst the empty land, a lone figure moved. Slowly, her every step cautious and careful. She had no home, no family. She was alone, and her eyes searched desperately for any sign of shelter. Her name was Lyra. She was from a faraway planet, a place she could barely remember now. Everything she knew had been lost. The journey here had been long, and the path ahead felt endless. Lyra's body was weak from hunger, her clothes torn from traveling through the harsh terrain. Her hope was fading, but she had no choice but to keep moving. As she trudged through the dry landscape, her eyes caught something in the distance. A small figure, almost hidden behind a large boulder, moved. It was a human. She had seen humans before, but never up close. She had heard stories of them, of their strength and bravery, but they were also dangerous. Lyra paused, unsure of what to do. Should she approach? Should she hide? Her heart raced as the human came closer, but Lyra remained motionless. She could feel the ground vibrating slightly beneath her feet, a sign that something large was nearby. But it was too late to run now. The human had already seen her. The man was tall, strong-looking, with messy brown hair that was tangled from his long journey. He wore simple clothes, worn from use but practical. His eyes were sharp, but they softened as he saw Lyra. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at her for a moment, as if wondering what to do. Lyra kept her distance, unsure if this human was friend or foe. She had learned the hard way that trusting others often led to pain. But the human didn't make any sudden moves. He didn't reach for any weapon, didn't shout or demand answers. Instead, he knelt down on one knee, keeping his hands visible and calm. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice low and gentle. "Are you lost?" Lyra didn't answer. She didn't trust words, not after everything she had been through, but there was something in the way the human spoke that made her pause. Maybe it was the softness in his voice, or maybe it was the kindness in his eyes. Either way, she felt an odd pull to him, a sense of relief that she hadn't felt in a long time. The human stood up slowly, as if trying not to startle her. He then reached into his bag and pulled out a small piece of bread. It was rough and dry, but it was food. He held it out toward her, but she didn't move. "Eat," he said simply. "I'm not asking for anything in return. Just take it. You need it." Lyra's stomach growled, loud enough for the human to hear, but still, she didn't take the bread. Her body ached for food, but she didn't know if she could trust him. What if he was trying to trick her? What if he meant to use her weakness against her? The human seemed to understand her hesitation. He sat down on the ground, placing the bread between them. "I'll wait," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, they just stared at each other. The wind blew dust through the air, but the quiet was peaceful, almost comforting. Lyra's heart slowed, and she found herself wondering if this human was truly different from the others she had met. The human had no weapon. He wasn't demanding anything from her. All he offered was a piece of bread and a chance to rest. Slowly, cautiously, Lyra stepped forward. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the bread. Her hand shook as she picked it up, bringing it to her lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to quiet the gnawing hunger in her stomach. As she ate, the human didn't speak. He simply watched her, giving her space, not rushing her. It felt strange to her, but in the strangest way. It felt safe. When Lyra finished the bread, she looked up at him, meeting his eyes for the first time. There was no anger in them, no fear, only calm. Lyra didn't know what to say, but she felt something stir inside her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. Trust. I don't know what's going to happen next. She finally spoke, her voice hoarse from not using it. I'm alone, and I don't know where to go. The human nodded, understanding. I know what it's like to be alone, he said quietly. But you don't have to be alone anymore. I can help. Lyra wasn't sure what to think. Could she trust him? Could she really rely on a human? But in her heart, a tiny spark of hope began to grow. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure of the future, but maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to be so bad. As the human stood up, he offered his hand to her. Let's get you somewhere safe. You don't have to be out here alone anymore. Lyra hesitated, but the kindness in his eyes was too much to ignore. Slowly, she took his hand. The first step was always the hardest, but it felt like the right step, and so the journey began, not knowing what awaited them, but both feeling for the first time in a long while that they might not have to face it alone. The journey to safety that night was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind blowing across the rocky landscape. Lyra walked beside the human, each step slow but steady. She had never traveled with anyone before. The idea was strange, but there was something comforting about it. She was still cautious, keeping an eye on her surroundings, but the human was different from the others she had met. There was a calm about him, a steadiness that made her feel safe. His name, she had learned, was Jack. He was from a distant land, just like her, though he had lived among humans for most of his life. He told her little about his past, just enough to make her understand he wasn't entirely like the others. He had his own battles, his own scars, but he didn't speak of them much. Instead, he focused on moving forward. They traveled by day, moving as fast as the harsh terrain would allow. The desert around them stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of rock and dust. The heat was unbearable at times, but they kept moving. Jack always made sure there was enough water for both of them, even when it meant sacrificing his own comfort. Lyra hadn't realized how much she had missed the feeling of safety until now. She hadn't felt it in so long. At night, they made camp beneath the stars. Jack showed her how to build a fire with the small tools he carried, and for the first time in a long while, Lyra felt the warmth of a fire that wasn't born of fear or desperation. It was a fire of comfort, of hope. They sat around it, silently at first, the flickering light casting shadows on their faces. Lyra watched Jack as he poked at the fire with a stick. His face was tired, his eyes filled with the weight of long days, but he never complained. She couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude toward him. She had been alone for so long, and now there was someone by her side. What happens when we get to the shelter? She asked quietly, breaking the silence. Jack looked at her, his gaze steady. We'll keep moving forward. I have a place where we can rest, rebuild. You'll be safe there. Lyra wasn't sure what that meant. Safe. She hadn't felt safe in a long time. But the way Jack spoke, it made her believe it could be possible. That night, as Lyra lay beneath the stars, she couldn't sleep. The desert was so quiet, but it was an unsettling quiet. Her mind kept drifting back to the past, the years she had spent running, hiding, never knowing where her next meal would come from. But now there was Jack. He had offered her something she never thought she would have again, a future. A noise broke her thoughts, something distant but unmistakable. A low growl carried on the wind. Lyra's body tensed instantly, her senses sharp. She scanned the dark shadows around their camp, eyes darting back and forth, searching for movement. "You hear that?" she whispered to Jack. He sat up slowly, his hand going to the knife at his belt. "Yeah, stay quiet." Lyra held her breath, listening closely. The sound grew louder, closer. It was definitely an animal, but she had no idea what kind. It wasn't a creature she recognized from her world. Her mind raced. Should they run? Should they fight? "Stay behind me," Jack said quietly, his voice calm. "If it's dangerous, we deal with it." Lyra didn't have to be told twice. She moved behind him, her heart pounding. She had never been in a fight like this. Her instincts told her to run, to hide, but Jack was different. He didn't seem afraid. He was prepared, and that steadied her. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence again. Jack stayed alert, his body tense. Lyra held her breath, waiting for any sign of the creature. Then a shape appeared in the distance. A large, shadowy figure moving quickly across the desert. Lyra squinted, her breath catching in her throat as the creature came closer. It was massive, its form shifting in the darkness. She could barely make out its shape, but it didn't look friendly. Jack stepped forward, positioning himself between Lyra and the creature. "Stay down," he said, his voice low and firm. Lyra crouched behind him, her heart racing as the creature drew nearer. The ground seemed to shake beneath its heavy steps, the air thick with tension. She could hear its breathing now, deep and slow, as if it was just as cautious as they were. Suddenly, the creature stopped, standing still in the moonlight. It sniffed the air, its glowing eyes scanning the camp. Lyra could see its sharp teeth glinting in the darkness, and her fear surged. Was this the end? Would she have to fight for her life once again? But Jack didn't move. He stood his ground, not flinching. Lyra watched in awe as Jack slowly raised his hand, offering no threat, just a sign of peace. The creature took a cautious step forward, then another. It seemed to be judging them, considering whether they were a threat. Lyra held her breath, praying it would move on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the creature turned and disappeared into the darkness, its heavy footsteps fading into the night. Jack lowered his hand and exhaled slowly. "It's gone," he said quietly. Lyra let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "What was that thing?" Jack shook his head. "I'm not sure, but we're safe for now." Lyra felt a mix of relief and confusion. It was hard to believe that just a few hours ago, she had been wandering the desert alone, and now she had someone to fight beside her. As strange as it felt, it also felt like a small victory. They both sat down again, the fire crackling between them. Lyra couldn't help but smile, despite everything that had happened. They had made it through the night together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, but for the first time in a long time, Lyra felt a little less alone. A promise of shelter. The sun rose slowly, casting an orange glow over the desert landscape. Lyra sat by the fire, staring into the flames, still processing the events of the night. She had never faced such danger before, but Jack had stayed calm, protecting her without hesitation. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lyra allowed herself to feel something she hadn't allowed in a long time: hope. Jack was already packing their things, his movements steady and practiced. He had been awake long before her, and now, as the day began, he was ready to move forward. Lyra didn't know where they were going or what lay ahead, but she felt a strange sense of peace in his presence, ready to move. Jack asked as he finished gathering his gear, his eyes meeting hers. Lyra nodded, still feeling the weight of the previous night's events, but there was something about Jack that made her believe they could face whatever came next. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly. Jack smiled, a faint hint of warmth in his expression. "There's a place. It's not far, and it's safe. I've been working on it for a while. A place where we can rest, rebuild. I think you'll be comfortable there." The words lingered in the air. Comfortable. Lyra hadn't experienced comfort in a long time. She had spent so much time running from danger, from fear, from loneliness. To think there could be a place for her where she could feel safe almost seemed impossible. As they continued their journey through the desert, Jack led the way, his steps confident and sure. Lyra walked beside him, still unsure of what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel completely alone. She felt like she had a purpose, even if that purpose was just to keep moving forward with him. The terrain was rough, but Jack knew the land. He had lived in the desert for years, and it showed in the way he navigated through the rocky paths and dry riverbeds. Lyra followed closely behind, her gaze shifting from the distant mountains to Jack's back. She couldn't help but notice how steady he was, how unshaken by everything around him. It was a quality she admired, even if she didn't fully understand it. After hours of walking, they reached a small, secluded valley hidden between two towering cliffs. The valley was lush, with sparse vegetation, a rare sight in the desert. There was a small stream running through it, its water clear and cool. The air was still, carrying the scent of fresh grass and earth. It felt like a world apart from the barren desert they had just crossed. "This is it," Jack said, turning to her with a look of quiet pride. "This is the place. It's not much, but it'll keep us safe." Lyra stood at the entrance of the valley, taking in the peaceful scene. Before her, the valley was surrounded by high cliffs, offering natural protection from any outside threats. It felt like a hidden oasis in the middle of nowhere. She could see a small shelter in the distance, built from stone and wood, tucked neatly against the cliffs. It was simple, but it was enough. "Do you really think this is safe?" Lyra asked, her voice hesitant. The idea of trusting a place, of staying in one spot, felt strange to her. She had always moved, always stayed on the run. But now, there was this small, seemingly peaceful haven. Jack nodded, his gaze steady. "I've worked hard to make sure." "It is. It's not just a shelter. It's a place to rebuild, to start fresh." Lyra looked at him, wondering how someone could put so much effort into something for someone else, a stranger. She had never known kindness like this. She had been on her own for so long, she had forgotten what it felt like to rely on others. To trust someone without fear. As they made their way toward the shelter, Jack spoke again. "There's food and water here. I've stored enough to last for a while. We'll take it one day at a time, okay?" Lyra simply nodded, her mind swirling, with thoughts she couldn't quite put into words. She wasn't sure if she was ready to trust this place, to let her guard down. But there was a warmth in her chest, a small spark of something that told her maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. As they reached the shelter, Lyra paused, looking at the stone walls that Jack had built. It was clear that he had put his heart into it. The stones were arranged with care, the walls solid and secure. It wasn't just a shelter. It was a home a home she could share with him. "I didn't expect this," Lyra said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect to find ... this." Jack turned to her, his eyes kind. "You didn't have to expect it. It was always here. All you had to do was trust." Lyra swallowed hard, feeling something shift inside her. Trust, it was such a small word, but it carried so much weight. She had learned over the years that trust was something that could easily be broken, something that was often too fragile to hold on to. But now, standing in this place with Jack, it didn't seem so impossible. Maybe it wasn't about trusting everything all at once. Maybe it was about taking it one step at a time, as the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow over the valley. Lyra sat down on a rock outside the shelter, watching the sky. Jack sat beside her, and for the first time in a long time, they sat in silence, simply being. No words were needed. Lyra felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't alone, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The construction begins. The days passed quickly as the sun beat down on the valley, casting long shadows as it dipped below the horizon each evening. Lyra had never imagined she could feel so at home in one place. The valley was peaceful, and the shelter Jack had built was sturdy, offering them protection from the harsh world outside. But even in this place of safety, there was always work to be done. Jack had promised that the shelter would be a home, a place to rebuild, and now it was time to turn that promise into reality. The first day, Jack showed her the tools he had. Gathered rough, simple things, but they were enough. Together, they began to add more structure to the shelter, working side by side in the growing heat of the day. It wasn't easy, but Jack had a way of making the work seem less like a chore, and more like a shared purpose. Lyra found herself caught up in the rhythm of it, her hands moving almost instinctively to gather stones, secure beams, and help Jack build at first. Lyra stayed silent, unsure of what to say. She had never been part of something like this before. She had always been alone, fighting to survive on her own terms. But here, with Jack, the weight of the world didn't feel so heavy. There was something comforting about the simplicity of their work, the way their efforts seemed to make everything around them just a little more secure. "What kind of shelter were you planning to build?" Lyra asked, breaking the silence as she handed Jack a wooden beam. Jack paused for a moment, his hands resting on the beam before he set it down. "Something strong, something that can withstand the storms and the heat. A place that lasts." He looked at her, his eyes soft. "Place that can last for both of us." The words hung in the air, and Lyra felt a strange warmth in her chest. She wasn't sure what it meant, but it felt important. He wasn't just building a house. He was building something far more precious, a future. Over the next few days, Lyra began to take on more responsibilities. She learned how to shape stones, how to use the tools to build the foundation stronger, and how to help Jack fit the pieces together. The work wasn't easy, but it felt rewarding. Every stone they placed seemed to reinforce the bond they were quietly forming, a bond that had started with uncertainty but was slowly becoming something stronger. The mornings were the hardest. The heat of the desert sun was relentless, and the work was tiring, but Jack never complained. He pushed on, always moving forward, and that gave Lyra the strength to keep going. There were moments when she wanted to stop, to rest, but Jack always knew when to give her a break, when to offer a word of encouragement. "Don't worry," Jack said one morning as Lyra sat down, wiping the sweat from her brow. "We'll take it slow, one step at a time." Lyra looked up at him, surprised by how calm he was, even in the heat of the day. "How do you stay so calm?" Jack smiled faintly, his eyes twinkling with something like amusement. "It's not about staying calm. It's about knowing that, if we don't give up, we'll get there." It was simple, but it made sense. Lyra had never thought of it like that. She had always been in survival mode, always looking for the next challenge, the next fight. But here, with Jack, it felt different. They weren't fighting against something. They were building together. As the days went by, the shelter began to take shape. What had once been a pile of stones and beams was now becoming a solid home. Jack worked tirelessly, always pushing forward, always striving for something more. But it wasn't just about the shelter anymore. It was about them, about building something together. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Lyra stepped back and looked at the shelter. It was small, but it was perfect. It was everything they had. "Worked for is beautiful," Lyra said quietly, her voice filled with wonder. Jack looked over at her, a small smile crossing his face. "It's only the beginning," he said, his voice full of promise. The sound of a distant rumble interrupted their moment. Lyra looked toward the horizon, her heart beating a little faster. The weather had been calm for days, but now dark clouds were gathering, threatening a storm. "Storm's coming," Jack said, his voice steady. "We'd better finish securing the roof before it hits." Lyra nodded, moving quickly to help him. The storm was coming fast, and there wasn't much time. As they worked together to secure the roof, the wind picked up, howling through the valley. The shelter groaned under the pressure of the wind, but they didn't stop. Jack's movements were quick and sure, and Lyra followed his lead, her hands steady despite the rising panic in her chest. They finished just in time. The storm hit with a fury, the wind howling through the valley and the rain coming down in sheets. But inside the shelter, they were safe. They sat side by side, their backs against the cool stone wall. As the storm raged outside, Lyra's heart still raced, but she felt a sense of peace in the storm's wake. The shelter was strong, the roof secure. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could face it. Jack looked at her, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the fire they had built inside the shelter. "We made it," he said simply. Lyra nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. Together, she whispered. The storm continued outside, but inside the shelter, Lyra felt safe for the first time in years. It wasn't just the walls that made her feel secure. It was the quiet understanding between them, the promise that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The turning point, the days after the storm were quiet, the air fresh and cool, the world washed clean by the rain. Lyra and Jack worked together to finish the shelter, adding finishing touches to the stone walls and securing the remaining beams. It felt like everything was coming together, like their hard work was finally paying off. Lyra found herself starting to enjoy the work, and even more than that, she began to look forward to their quiet evenings, when the world outside seemed far away, but something had changed. Jack's energy, once unwavering, seemed to be fading. He had grown quieter, his movements slower. Lyra noticed it when he bent down to lift a stone and paused longer than usual, his face tight with strain. The weight of the past few days had taken its toll on him, and Lyra could see it. The way his shoulders sagged, the way his eyes looked distant, it was clear that he was exhausted. perhaps more than he was willing to admit. Lyra asked one evening, her voice soft, almost afraid to break the fragile peace that had settled between them. "Are you okay?" Jack didn't answer right away. He sat on a large rock near the shelter, his head resting in his hands. The sun was setting, the sky streaked with colors of orange and purple, but the weight in the air wasn't from the evening calm. Lyra could feel it, a tension between them that hadn't been there before. "I'm fine," Jack said, his voice strained, but he didn't look up. "Just tired." Lyra didn't believe him. She walked over and sat beside him, her eyes scanning his face, trying to understand what was really going on. "You've been pushing yourself too hard. You don't have to do it all alone." Jack finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know how else to do it, Lyra. This place is supposed to be safe. For you, for both of us. But I can't help but feel like I'm failing you." He paused, his voice softening. "I promised you a home, a future, but I'm not sure I have the strength to keep going." Lyra's heart tightened in her chest. She had never seen Jack like this vulnerable, uncertain. She had always seen him as the strong one, the one who knew what to do and where to go. But now he was human. He was like her. He was afraid. "You're not failing me," Lyra said, quietly, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You've already given me more than I ever thought possible. A home, safety, trust." Jack looked down at her hand, then back at her. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, maybe surprise, maybe hope. "But what if it's not enough?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra took a deep breath. She had been running from her past for so long. She had forgotten what it was like to stop, to face the truth of who she was. But with Jack, everything had changed. She wasn't alone anymore. And maybe that was enough. "We've made it this far together," Lyra said firmly. "That means something. We've already done more than either of us thought possible. And if we keep going, we'll make it through anything else, together." There was a long pause as Jack seemed to absorb her words. Slowly, he nodded, the tightness in his face loosening. He wasn't completely better, but Lyra could see that, for the first time in a long while, he believed in something again. Jack sighed deeply, his shoulders relaxing. "Maybe you're right," he admitted. "I've been trying to carry everything by myself, but I don't have to." Lyra smiled, feeling a lightness in her chest. She wasn't sure if they were truly safe yet, if the world outside their shelter was kind enough to let them live without fear. But she knew one thing for sure. Jack wasn't alone anymore, and neither was she. As the night fell around them, the stars began to twinkle in the clear sky above. The shelter stood strong, its stone walls solid and unyielding. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was their home, their place of peace, built on hard work, trust, and something deeper that neither of them had expected to find. The winds that had once seemed so threatening now felt gentle. The world outside their shelter felt less frightening. They weren't alone, and that made all the difference. Jack stood up, stretching his arms above his head, and turned to Lyra with a new determination in his eyes. "Let's finish this," he said, his voice steady again. "Together." Lyra nodded, a spark of hope igniting within her. They had a future ahead of them, a future they would build together. And for the first time in a long time, Lyra wasn't afraid to face it. The final test, the days that followed, were filled with work. But now there was a renewed energy between them. Jack had recovered from his exhaustion, and Lyra had found a rhythm in the daily tasks. Each stone they placed, each beam they secured, bringing them closer to the shelter they had both dreamed of. The shelter was almost complete, strong, secure, and ready to be their home for as long as they needed. But as much as they had achieved, there was still one challenge left. The outside world, the valley, as peaceful as it seemed, had never been truly safe. Jack had spoken of this before, but Lyra hadn't understood until now. They had been working hard, focused on the task at hand, but in doing so, they had let their guard down. The valley might have been sheltered, but it was also isolated, vulnerable to threats from the unknown. On one of their morning walks, as Jack and Lyra made their way through the valley, Lyra noticed a shift in the air. The wind had grown still, the usual hum of the environment gone. It was too quiet, too calm. Jack, too, seemed to sense it, his eyes scanning the horizon, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. "Do you hear that?" Lyra asked, her voice tense. Jack nodded, his gaze locked on the path ahead. "It's too quiet. Stay close." Lyra's heart began to race as she moved closer to him, every muscle in her body alert. The tension in the air was suffocating. The quiet wasn't just unsettling, it was wrong. Something was out there, something they hadn't prepared for. Jack turned to her, his expression hardening. "Get inside the shelter, now." Lyra didn't hesitate. She had learned to trust him by now, and she could see it in his eyes. He was certain of the danger. She ran towards the shelter, glancing over her shoulder as she went. Jack was right behind her, his pace steady but quick. As they reached the entrance to the shelter, Jack quickly secured the door, his movements practiced, but Lyra could feel her pulse quicken as she watched him. They had been so focused on building their life here, they hadn't considered the possibility that it could all be torn apart in an instant. "What's out there?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling. Jack didn't answer immediately. He moved to one of the small windows in the shelter and peered through the narrow slit. Lyra joined him, her eyes widening as she saw what he saw. A dark figure loomed at the edge of the valley, its silhouette massive and intimidating. It was impossible to tell what it was from this distance, but it didn't look like anything they had seen before. Its shape shifted unnaturally, and the ground beneath it seemed to tremble. With every step, Lyra's breath caught in her throat. "What is that?" Jack didn't take his eyes off the creature. "I don't know, but it's dangerous. Stay here." Before Lyra could protest, Jack was already moving towards the back of the shelter. She wanted to stop him, to tell him that he didn't have to do this alone, but she knew better. Jack wasn't the type to run, and she wasn't going to let him face this danger by himself. Lyra grabbed her own knife, one she had been carrying for protection, and followed him. The wind outside had picked up, the storm clouds swirling ominously above them. The valley, which had felt like a safe haven only hours before, now felt like a trap. "Jack," Lyra called, her voice shaking as she caught up with him. "Let me help." He stopped and turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Stay behind me. I'm not taking any chances." The creature was closer now, moving slowly but steadily towards them. It had a strange, almost fluid motion, like it wasn't entirely solid. It made no sound as it walked, only the thrum of its presence vibrating through the ground. Jack stepped forward, his posture tense, his hand gripping the knife tightly. "We don't know what it is or what it wants," he muttered, "but we'll face it together." Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she moved beside him. She didn't want to be afraid. She didn't want to feel helpless. But everything in her told her that this creature wasn't just a threat to their shelter. It was a threat to everything they had built, to everything they were trying to protect. The creature stopped just outside the edge of the valley, its glowing eyes fixed on them. Lyra could feel its gaze like a weight pressing down on her, and her fingers tightened around the knife. But Jack didn't move. He stood tall, his body a barrier between her and the creature. The creature let out a low, growling sound, its body pulsing with a strange, rhythmic vibration. Lyra could feel it in her bones. She had never been so scared in her life. "Get ready," Jack whispered, his voice low but firm. "If it moves, we fight. But if it doesn't, we wait." Lyra nodded, her mind racing. The silence that stretched between them felt like an eternity, the air thick with tension. The creature didn't move. It just stood there, staring at them. With those glowing eyes, time seemed to slow. Then, just as Lyra was about to take a step forward, the creature slowly turned and began to retreat into the distance. Its movements were deliberate, almost cautious. For a moment, it seemed like they had won, but Lyra didn't feel victorious. The danger was still there, lingering in the air. Just out of reach, Jack lowered his knife, his breath coming in slow, steady breaths. "It's gone for now, but it will be back." Lyra's heart was still pounding, but she nodded, understanding what Jack meant. The creature had retreated, but the threat was far from over. They had survived this test, but there would be more to come, and they would face it together. For the first time, Lyra understood the true meaning of safety. It wasn't about the shelter, the stone walls, or the work they had done. It was about each other, and as long as they had that, they could survive anything. A new beginning, the storm had passed, but the air still carried a sense of unease. The creature that had appeared at the edge of the valley was gone, but the tension lingered. Jack and Lyra sat together outside the shelter, their backs against the cool stone wall, staring out at the peaceful landscape before them. The silence between them was comfortable now, not filled with the fear of the unknown, but with the quiet understanding that they had faced something together and survived. For the first time in weeks, Lyra felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. The valley, with all its beauty and danger, had become something more. It wasn't just a place to hide, it was their home. And in that home, they had built more than just walls and shelter. They had built trust, resilience, and a future. Jack glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Lyra nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think I am. For the first time, I feel like I can breathe." Jack's smile grew, and he leaned back, his hands resting behind his head. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Lyra's mind drifted back to the first day they met. The fear, the uncertainty, the loneliness that had surrounded her like a cloud. But now, with Jack by her side, everything felt different. She wasn't alone anymore, and that was more than she ever could have hoped for. "We've built something together," she said quietly, her voice full of meaning. Jack turned his head to meet her eyes, his expression serious now. "Yeah, we have, and we'll keep building. Every day, we get stronger." The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the valley. The sky was streaked with hues of pink and orange, and the valley itself seemed to glow with the promise of a new day. The winds had settled, and the world around them seemed peaceful again. Lyra stood, brushing the dirt from her clothes. She felt the weight of the days past, the work, the struggle, but also something lighter, a sense of possibility. She walked toward the shelter, her movements slow but sure. Jack followed her, his steps matching hers. "We'll need to keep watch," Jack said, his voice low. "The creature could come back, and there's always more to be done." Lyra nodded. She knew the danger wasn't gone. The world outside the valley would never be completely safe, but that didn't matter as much anymore. They had each other, and with that, they could face whatever came next as they entered the shelter. Lyra stopped for a moment, her hand resting on the wooden doorframe. She glanced back at the valley, the place they had worked so hard to make their own. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And for the first time, Lyra felt like she had a place where she truly belonged. Turning back to Jack, she smiled. "We've made it, haven't we?" Jack smiled back, a full, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Yeah, we have." The two of them stood in the doorway, looking out at the valley they had claimed as their own. The future was still uncertain, and the dangers of the world would always be present. But in this moment, it didn't matter. They had built a home, and that was enough. Tomorrow, they would continue to work, to grow, and to face whatever challenges came their way. Together, and for the first time in a long time, Lyra felt like there was nothing they couldn't overcome. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was part of something bigger. She was part of a family. And in that moment, Lyra understood what it meant to truly be home.